Hey there, everyone. We're back again with another Live with Lindsay, and I'm really excited to be back a little more consistently now. So thanks for joining us again, and I'm really looking forward to today's topic, because we're going to be talking about conflict, which is something I talk about a lot, but specifically talking about conflict in relation to decision-making in business. And we're joined tonight by Christi Scarrow, who is a consultant, coach, and author of the book Truth Warriors. So I'll bring Christi in just a moment. Christi helps people to lean in and out of conflict, to embrace positive tension and create harmonious relationships. She helps leaders to make decisions that count for themselves, their teams, and their business. She's passionate about creating clarity, connection, and accountability to enable a world based on truth. So with that, I will bring Christi in and also just ask, well, so first of all, I guess I should say hi.
Hi, Lindsay, good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. And for everyone listening, if you could just let us know here in the comments that you're here with us, maybe let us know where you're listening from, if there's anything particular you're wanting to learn from Christi tonight about conflict. And I will interject at any point with any questions that people have. Maybe I'll just start off by saying that I really like that last line of your bio about creating clarity, connection, and accountability to enable a world based on truth. And really resonated with me. And then I had a moment of, but where is the truth? What is that truth? And I guess that part is part of what you're talking about in relation to conflict and decision making. So can we start maybe just a little bit by exploring what got you into specifically focusing on the link between conflict and decision making in your work?
Yeah, well, and as I said, it sort of started all encompassing with this idea of finding truth and enabling truth. And as you said, that initially led me down the path of, well, what is truth? And recognizing as part of that it really is shaped by our experience. There's our own perspectives, and there's our truth, and there's your truth, and then there's what I believe to be a collective truth and perspectives. And ultimately, if you think about how do you shape that, it's in the decisions that we make every day. So I saw the link there initially to say, okay, if we're trying to really find commonality and bring together our own separate experiences into something that we can align on, because I think that, connecting the world is so important these days, especially. It really starts with making those decisions in ourselves, and supporting better team decisions making is a part of that, recognizing other perspectives. So that's, for me, probably how truth turned into decision making. And then, as you said, that link from decision making to conflict was because what I started to recognize, again, if you think about the need in decision making to consider different perspectives, that means that sometimes we need to lean into conflict, meaning we need to be able to speak up and be willing to say the hard things. And sometimes we need to be quiet. And I know I've been in both of those situations. And so for me, I think that was the key. It was really thinking about how do we find that balance in conflict.
I really like the wording of it. When I received your bio, I thought about myself, the times in my life when, I've maybe leaned a little too much into conflict, including at the beginning of the pandemic on Facebook. I had to catch myself and say, okay, no, this is not the road you want to go down. And then the times that I've maybe leaned out when I needed to lean in. And so I'd love it if those listening, I'm going to ask Christi to explain what she means by that. But if you kind of keep in mind what's gone on in your life, maybe as she's explaining. So can you kind of just review for us what you mean by, let's start with maybe, leaning into conflict?
Yeah, as you said, I think when we talk about leaning into it, it is being willing to have those difficult conversations. And so we think about conflict, I think naturally there's a thought that it's a negative thing. And conflict, probably as it's been described and how we've been taught about it, is a negative thing. But there's a lot of research and work around the idea of productive conflict. And that's why I talk about positive tension. And the reality is, to make the best decisions, you need some level of positive tension. You need to be able to be willing to suspend your own beliefs a little bit so that you're considering alternatives. And so leaning in, to me, means that you are willing to kind of express your perspective, and then the leaning out is you're willing to listen. So as you said, and I think part of the interesting, I had this sort of concept in my head before the pandemic, but certainly it brought it to life even more, which is this idea of, we have such strong opinions and they can be so dividing, and it's frustrating to feel that when there's a time when we so need to support each other, and yet we become almost more judgmental, and we hang so tightly onto, this is the way it has to be. And that's my ultimate desire, and why I kind of talk about truth and connection together, because it's really important to me that people find a way to come together, especially in these difficult times. And leaning in means I'm giving you the ability to express what you feel. I'm also realizing that what I'm experiencing and my opinion and my judgment may not be the same, and that's okay. And as you said, I think a lot of us, so easy to do, especially now, either was sending your kids back to school or don't. Do you wear a mask? Do you not? There's a whole bunch of that, happening initially, and there's just a lot of unknowns right now. So when there's unknowns, it's even easier to kind of just jump to our quick opinions and fight for them, when in reality, I like to say, we're all in the same ocean, just in different boats, right? So it's a matter of fighting the same fight together, which is why I see it kind of as this collective battle.
I see it as a collective battle too, right? And I think, the pandemic is just an example, or a heightened example maybe, of interaction styles that have been, around forever. But like you say, that heightened stress and uncertainty is, I think, exacerbating our tensions, and hence why, when I think back to the first 3 weeks of the pandemic, and I found myself fighting about, conclusions around data that made no empirical sense, and realized, I'm not listening. I'm just arguing my point vehemently. And that's not who I've grown to become necessarily, or at least not consistently. Not to say I still sometimes do lean into conflict when I don't need to, but yeah, I see that a lot in in the work I've done and in my own life experience, that that ability to, I guess, notice when you're leaning in and maybe it's not the time, or when you're leaning out and it's maybe not the time, is a bit hard. So can you maybe, I'd love to hear from you, some of your experience. I know you've done a lot of consulting in this work. How do you see this play out in business? And before I get you to answer that, I'll just say that anyone here who's listening, I'd love to hear from you, if you're willing to share. Is your tendency more to lean into conflict, to lean out? What are you noticing in yourself as you're listening? And now I forgot my last question, so I hope you're
asking. I think how it
Sorry.
shows up. That's okay. Around how it shows up in business, right? I think that's kind of where you're going with it, and I think you kind of also touched it. It's about that self-awareness as a starting point, which is a struggle for most of us to kind of know, especially around emotional topics. So again, why the pandemic was probably setting a lot of people off is because we were in such uncertainty, because it was emotional, because there was fear surrounding it. And I think, as you said, it's about kind of recognizing those opportunities where I think my tendency is to maybe lean into conflict more. And I'm like you. I think, I've kind of had to learn to move the other way and to not be quite as opinionated as, recognizing that there's not always a benefit of sharing my opinion and not allowing others to express theirs. Because if I come in so strongly, then I'm not giving them the space to share. And I think that's what happens in business, right? Is the strong voices in the room, and I tend to be one of them. Some of my partners are listening there. I'm sure they're nodding their heads. So I tend to be one of them, but it's the strong voices in the room, I think, have to recognize when to not be the strong voice in the room, because they are missing something. So if I'm always expressing what I feel, I'm not learning, right? I'm speaking. So I need to stop and pause and go, okay, did I miss something? And the other thing that I've learned to do, and I'm still probably working on it, is to be careful when I'm talking and asking for advice or perspectives, that I'm not just trying to validate my own perspective. That's an easy thing to get caught in. And I think that in business as well happens. So if we're really ultimately trying to make better decisions and build a great team dynamic, it means that, I know you're going to think differently than me. You probably will. And that's okay. And that's a good thing. I should be able to leverage those strengths in decision making. And I should be willing to think that maybe there's alternatives to my way of thinking. So I think that's how it shows up in both those ways. I don't know if I did answer your question, but
yeah, I know you did. And you were, so one of the things that popped into my mind while you were saying that was how there's like a societal predisposition to value those who lean in more than those who lean out, I feel, at least, and which left me for a long time in my life feeling like that was a great strength to have. And it is in some respects, right? The fact that I'm, will speak up, but I hadn't seen the challenges of it, I think. And, I take responsibility for that, but I think also in the context of a society where, and again, this is just my perception, but where, those who sit back and reflect a little more and are often later to contribute or choose not to, aren't necessarily perceived as, go-getters or being motivated. And it took me a while to start to tease apart that those aren't the same thing. So I'm curious if you've seen that at all in your work.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. There is this you got the word. And it's interesting. I'm actually reading the book Quiet right now, which is all kind of starting to talk to that point, which is, we kind of reward those people who are the ones that are willing to speak up. And I think that is a mistake. I think great leaders are really good at recognizing those and making sure to draw out those others who are not necessarily the loudest voices in the room. Because often when you do, you hear great things from them. It's just they're maybe uncomfortable in the moment, or they're not certain how to say it. And so when I think about the different dynamics, and in my book and in the model I've created, it's got an assessment that kind of tells you where you fall on the conflict spectrum or on the decision spectrum. And the purpose of it, because it's not intended to put people in a box, the purpose of it is to recognize how others think differently. And being able to go, okay, if I'm the kind of person that is willing to speak up, then how do I support the person who isn't? How do I recognize that in the team, as the leader or as my peer? And then how do I then encourage them? But I think you're absolutely right. And it's one of the challenges. And I think that's something I've probably learned as I've aged as well, is that there's something you feel like when you're younger, there's something you have to prove. And so by speaking up and giving your opinion and saying, this is how it is, you are, and you're smiling because it sounds like you and I.
That's totally where it came from for me too. Yeah, the more confident I got, the more I could leave space for others.
Yeah, and so I think you feel like that's a reward for you, right? That's a reward because I got to say my opinion and people were listening, and then the older I've gotten, the more I've started to realize, and then learning from my colleagues and the people I've worked with, is that sometimes it's that quiet learning that again is so much more powerful, and people feel much more accepted and listened to, and that in itself creates a better environment rather than me going, well, if I got a great idea, I got to share it. And I'd still say it's difficult to hold it back, but I think it's really important at the same time.
Okay, so I just want to go to the comments here, but then I want to remind me to show the link to your assessment in case it slips my mind. So Greg here is saying, I think the key is how I share. So in terms of the way of sharing, I guess. And as Christi says, how tight I hold on to what I share. Yeah, that's a great point, Greg. So can you talk to me about that? The whole piece of how tightly those opinions are held, because that really speaks to me.
Yeah, well, and I think it's human nature. I think that's the one thing, and it's something I touch on, which is this idea of, we have very strong beliefs, and they're shaped by so many different things, and it's really hard to change what people believe, and sometimes we shouldn't necessarily. But I think the reality is it's about considering that there might be a different way. Is the hard part, is kind of recognizing that what I used to believe when I was younger is actually different now. So it's quite possible that I can learn something that's going to shape it even more so. And so as I think as Greg was alluding to, it's a little bit about how you share it, right? So even if you step into a situation where you're like, that's crazy, that thought, which I know I've done, and I mean, like, that thought is absolutely crazy. I think it's stopping you from trying to keep going with that thought and go, wait a second, why am I dismissing this? Am I dismissing it because I'm just really haven't thought it through? I don't understand it. And so I think that's the opportunity to go help me understand that thought more, as opposed to what might have been my natural tendency, which was to kind of counterbalance it. Well, I think this and this and this. And that's the challenge, I think, is just we can't really stop the bias that shapes us. We can't really stop the ability to kind of, hold strongly to our beliefs, but we can sort of stop and wonder if perhaps there's reasons why we're missing information alternatively.
Yeah. And I would say that bias kind of changes over time by doing that consistently. And not to say that I think it ever fully disappears, but I can see in myself that I used to sort of equate the idea with the person, right? So if I reject your idea, I reject you as a person, whether I was intentionally doing that or not. It was, I think, certainly the message I was sending and also perceiving. And yeah, learning to undo that a bit. Not to say it never happens. I mean, I'm going to be honest, like, I don't want to get political, but talking about Donald Trump, I have a hard time still teasing apart the person from the ideas, but I can much better than before see the humanity, I guess, of the person behind the things. And so I do see where that bias does lessen sometimes over time. Like, isn't that realistic? I'm curious.
I think the bias, the more you can kind of put definition to it, I think the more you can kind of go, maybe I am biased. And the only way to do that, and social media is like the worst at just reinforcing your bias. And ultimately, we like to be around people that are like us, and we listen to things that resonate with us, and we look for information to support our beliefs. That's all human nature. And so, I mean, the example for Donald Trump, admittedly, I'm not a fan either. But I actually purposely followed some of the information. I would look at Fox News. I would look at alternative sources, and primarily to say, there's a reason why a lot of people support him. I'm not sure I understand it, but I want to understand why it is they do. What do they see? And that's something that is difficult to do, because your instinct might say, I don't understand how people can't think this way. It seems so obvious to me. And so when I know when that idea creeps in, like, how on earth could they possibly believe this? I actively try to find ways to think about, well, why do they believe that? There must be a reason why they think that to be true. And maybe it's about a lot of times I'm sure they're not exposed to the same information as me. That's one of the
different life experiences. I mean,
different life experiences, right? Different, I want to say different values, but that's actually going to a judgment. So ultimately but you're right. It's really easy to sometimes, and I'm certainly guilty of it. It's really easy to go, if that person doesn't believe what I do, you kind of judge them to be different from you, right? To not have the same values. And that's where, part of my objective in this idea of Truth Warriors is to go, it doesn't have to be about judgment, right? It shouldn't be as ideal. It should be about, the opinions can be different. That doesn't mean that we are different people or that we don't have ultimately similar goals.
Yeah. So I will bring this back to business and the comments in a second, but I have joined some Facebook pages I'm no longer a therapist, but used to be, and a speech therapist, not a real therapist, but not a psychologist is what I mean. But I've joined some Facebook pages of neurodivergent therapists, just because I'm, interested, and the discussions are phenomenal because it's a lot of difference of opinion, a lot of disagreement, but respectfully. But because of the way that they're all very aware of when they're if somebody says something in a way that is a bit aggressive, someone will say, I feel, in the way I'm reading what you've written, it makes me feel like this, and I'm and I'm wondering if you X, Y, Z. And so the discussions get to such a depth of talking about the actual issues that I love it. I eat it up. It's fascinating because I think it's teasing apart that piece of what is being able to have different opinions while also respecting you as a person and your opinion, even when different than mine. So it's really neat. I do just want to come back to the comments here. So Nancy is saying that introverts are often left behind. Yeah, absolutely. And Imran's sharing that introverts often produce the highest quality work in his experience. And also saying alternative opinion and thought is an opportunity to collect more data, thus making better decisions with the information you have, which is exactly your area of expertise. So let's talk about that piece for a bit, the link with data and information gathering.
Yeah, and interesting. So just as I kind of think of the idea of leaning in and out of conflict, I think it's the same in decision making. And you have those that are much more rational in their way they make decisions, meaning they need a lot of information and data before they can move forward, and others that work quite well on just making intuitive decisions, and they tend to be quick, but maybe not as well thought out. And so I think data gathering as a perspective is quite necessary. And then at some point, again, there's a balance of that, because you can get lost in too much information. And there's people that struggle with decision making that can't move forward because they feel like they haven't got all the information. And the reality is, for most decisions, I mean, we can never predict the future. In fact, human beings are very poor predictors of the future. So if we think we can, we're probably wrong. But as we're trying to do it, there's this desire to just think of every scenario. And when I used to teach decision-making classes, and I focus very much on the rational decision model, I've shifted a bit away to go, I think the rational decision model is important, but we are so affected by bias and intuition in ways we don't even know. It's unfair to say that if we just start thinking more rationally, like, we'll make better decisions. It's much broader than that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. So can you maybe give some concrete ways? This is a divide, for lack of a better word, that I see often in tension, right? Between that really rational way of making decisions and wanting to focus solely on data, and then sort of saying, to heck with the data, this feels great, let's do this. And when there's not an ability to explore the different perspectives and understand them, it does lead to an awful lot of tension. So do you have some concrete advice on people on how to navigate those kinds of differences in their teams?
Yeah, I think it's about, I think there needs to be more structure in decision making. And that means sort of starting with the end in mind, which is, what does success look like? What problem are we trying to solve? Often that's skipped, and we start to go to the solution mode. And there's lots of techniques that you can use to get a little bit clearer on the problem, and being able to start there. And I think it's a combination of defining where we're trying to go, finding a common thought on how we're going to get there, and then also recognizing our differences and the contributions we can add. Because if I know that, Lindsay, you're going to run away and you're probably going to be the data gatherer, okay, I want that to be your role in this. And everybody has a role to play. Whereas I know if I go to that person, they're probably going to be able to just sort of give me some kind of crazy creative ideas because they're thinking that way, but they may not have any validation to them. So I think it's leveraging the strengths of the team to go, if I understand how you make decisions and I've got some structure around it. Another practical tip that I've heard is, because you're doing it in your teams, and I did speak to a number of leaders about how they make decisions and kind of pulling together the concepts. And the one shared with me, he always invites somebody in that is outside the group to weigh in on the decision itself. So because you can get very much into this group think, right? You can get into this, tunnel vision of this is how it's been done. And you just bring somebody else in who has very little, involvement in it, and isn't necessarily impacted by the decision. And then they can kind of provide an outside perspective. So without necessarily then piling on a whole new information. So I think it's finding commonality in the group, aware of how each person can contribute. One other thing I also talk about is what I call a post-mortem or a pre-mortem. So again, what could happen? So instead of sort of evaluating the decision after, we're evaluating the negative result of the decision before it even happens. And if you think about, okay, if this could go here and here, let's think about some of the considerations as part of that. So that's just another thing that I found quite helpful in decision making.
I can see what you're saying, that if there's more structure behind the decision making process, then there's already consensus there, right? In the team, or a common understanding, where then there's not the pulling between, well, how much are we going to use data and how much are we not, and just how long do we gather data for, and all those kind of things. And then when you talked about an outside perspective, it brought me back to several years ago when I was consulting on a team where we had kind of our process. It was a really creative process for solving problems. And then we had to work with another team of consultants on a project who just had a wildly different process. And I remember so clearly that first meeting together, because it was a disaster, quite frankly, right? Because we didn't sit down to kind of iron out our difference. I think it only became evident as we were going through the process how different of styles our teams had, but it had never necessarily crossed our mind that we wouldn't just all be using the same sort of style. So I can certainly speak to where that outside perspective, for me, it was just the outside perspective of someone coming in who wasn't used to the process we used, for me to realize, maybe this isn't effective for
Well,
everyone.
and it's interesting. You made me think of kind of a story that was something I experienced, which was illustrating the very different ways we were thinking. And we were asked to do a task. We were divided. This was actually by Myers-Briggs, sort of by more of a thinking group and a feeling group. And both groups were told to go and decide who should be chosen for this all-star, I can't remember, hockey team. And how do you decide which players get to actually be on this team? So you have 20, you can only pick 15. That was the task. So one group, thinking group, of which I was a part of at the time, we were like, what's the criteria? How do we rank it? Let's decide. And we're going to rank the people by whatever. And there we go. That's our choice. On the other group, they came back and said, we're going to ask the team who they think are the right people. It's a completely different approach. We were like ranking criteria and decide and make it fair. And they were like, no, let's make it inclusive. Let's make it collaborative. Let's involve the team in the decision. Very, very different ways of approaching it. And you don't think about that, because if you're actually probably a very strong team, you actually may not even realize that you are going down a path of just doing it as you always have. And you're just like, ding, bang, boom, we can work together. We'll figure it out. But then you're going, wait a second. It's almost too smooth. And decision making, in fact, like big decisions shouldn't be smooth. They should be rocky, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, what you're saying there. And I think, like yourself, I have also somewhat shifted from, I would have absolutely been in that thinking group. I don't know where I'd land today, but what I have seen is by learning to appreciate, I was in a very data-driven science, statistically driven field before. And I see how by not leaning into the other approach to a certain extent, I guess there's decisions I make today differently now that I understand the value of that. And so I really like what you're saying about how getting all that out on the table and worked out does lead to better decisions. And can you talk to me a bit about how, and let me just interject too, if people have questions for Christi, please stick those in the chat and I'll get to them right away. I forgot my question. Yeah, it's gone. There's something about decision making and conflict.
Well, that would make sense. Yeah, that's something I was going to say earlier too. It's all gone. That just means our conversation.
Yeah, it's all gone. My kid is not sleeping, so my thoughts are like in and out, gone in a split second. So, but it's all good.
I think we're all like that in this pandemic a little bit. Focus is a little bit smaller.
I'm like that on the best of days. So, yeah. Okay, so let me look at your list here of things that get back on track. Okay, so I guess one of the things I'd really like to touch on is, conflict in the team specifically. So you've got a process, but then you have people who are really stuck on still kind of doing it their way, whether that's the intuitive way or not, that there's just one way, but, more intuitively, how do you navigate all of that as a leader, as you're trying to, bring this into your decision-making style?
Yeah, and that's probably always the challenge, which is how do you navigate diverse ways of thinking, right? And different, and if somebody, and it was interesting, again, I'm talking to the various leaders, one of the things that every single person said who, when I asked about their decision style, said it's changed. As I've, I spoke with someone who was a CEO, and he's an engineer, very rational in his decision making, and he said, I would say I'm less so now because I've had to be. And I said, and the other way, those who said, I used to just decide like this on my gut, and I recognized that I was missing information, and I had to rely on other people to help me be the validators and thinkers. And so, as you said, I think some of the challenge is still those who may not have the self-awareness of the implications they're having. And as a leader, ideally you're leveraging their strengths and you're guiding them towards the things that, and having them understand through appropriate feedback, what are some of the implications. So, I think about, I was coaching somebody and she came to me saying, really, it was all about decision-making. She said, I just don't, my decisions are too slow. That's what everyone's telling me in the organization. And as we went through the coaching process, one of the things we drew out is that, in fact, she just made very different types of decisions than the rest of the group. She was being expected that she would be able to make decisions quite quickly. And I think in acknowledging that she could take a little bit longer, but there was finding that balance. So it was all of a sudden getting confidence with the fact that the way she made decisions was not wrong, but it was
Yes.
different. And I think the thing is, when you're in that spot, you're feeling a bit overwhelmed, and you probably do feel like a little bit of the square peg going, well, if I'm slowing this team down, or maybe I'm moving too quickly, I'm frustrated by the fact that nobody else is deciding fast enough. So if you're kind of the outlier in that, you feel that. And I think it's sort of being confident that, and the leader needs to reinforce the fact and support the fact that there's a reason. It's okay the way you make decisions, but here's how you might be able to help the team, and here's the ways in which you just need to think a little bit differently. So I think that's the coaching the leader needs to do, and how I've seen it work well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I really see too when, whether it's specific to decision making or some other element of interpersonal communication, when you feel like your way of doing it is the wrong way, which often just means that within the organization you're in the minority type of, whether it's that decision-making style or whatnot, right? Like that's that sort of feeling of, I'm not fitting in here. That it's kind of becomes this self-perpetuating loop, right? Where you don't feel you quite fit in, so you don't want to speak up as much, and then you're not heard as much, and it snowballs into not being able to grow those skills, because you also don't want to kind of admit, hey, this isn't how I do things. And so I do think that leaning into whatever natural style you have helps you to actually grow so I don't want to say in the areas of weakness, but you know what I mean? Like learn to hone some of the skills that are a bit more difficult for you. So like we were talking about earlier, for me, it was a lot of learning to like be uncomfortable with silence and leave space and ask more questions and things like that.
And you're pretty good at it. You're pretty good at asking questions.
Depends on what kind of mode I'm in. Talk to my children.
Yeah.
No, I certainly have made a lot of progress. I would not say it's something that it's still something I have to think about. Sometimes I have to catch myself in, more stressful moments, like everyone. And I think that's part of the journey, right? Is not so much towards this perfection where every interaction becomes super smooth. Like you said, there's always, an element of tension, not always, but it's normal for there to be an element of tension is what I'm trying to say.
And I think the hard part is just feeling comfortable with being uncomfortable, which is definitely not a natural thing for a lot of people, right? It's so, but I think the leader needs to, acknowledge that they have to demonstrate that they themselves are comfortable with somebody challenging them, which I find is a lot of the times part of the issue. Is a leader who will say, well, why people aren't coming to you with solutions, and the minute someone does, they're like, no, that's not right. I'm like, well, I think I know why they're not coming to you with solutions, because every time they do, they get really shut down. Or as a leader, again, how do you, if somebody is the kind of person is an introvert, or is a very rational thinker, how do you set them up so that they can contribute in that way, versus sort of saying, okay, we're going to have a team meeting and we're going to do it, this way. It does have to consider the different ways in which people can contribute, because that's the best way you're going to get enough perspectives.
Yeah, that's what I've seen too. The people who do develop the skills to engage people differently, right? Based on people's natural styles, like you say, making sure that the fit of what that person is working on is a good fit for their strengths, and making sure you're, leaving space for those who don't naturally speak up without forcing them, because there's also has to be that line of not pushing them into having to be more extroverted, but they can kind of adapt to the different needs. Leads, I think, to an environment where people feel more comfortable. For one, I just want to go into the comments here. So Marnie's saying that acknowledging differences in decision making can be really helpful. There's strength in all approaches, which I think is what you're saying there about strength in all approaches, like truly having that belief, I think is a lot of what underlines the work that you do, eh?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's bringing people along is key. And that's very much, at Lighthouse 9, one of the key things in change management is how do we bring people along the journey? And in decision making, it means that I'm going to role model risk taking. I'm going to allow for it. I'm going to let people be creative and suggest crazy ideas without suggesting it's a crazy idea. And and finding a way to funnel that, I think, into something beneficial.
Yeah, that part you're saying about reflecting as a leader on how you're modeling it. Like I see it in my parenting all the time, right? I'll be coaching something in my kids. So for instance, lately we've been working on name calling. That's a whole big thing in our house, how you don't call people names. And then I walked in the other day and I didn't call the dog a really bad name, but I said something, oh, you little stinky, whatever. And I was like, what a role model. No wonder my kids are saying way worse things, but still, right. It was a moment of reflection of, oh, I'm not fully being consistent with the behavior I'm trying to get a 9-year-old to do. And I'm 43. So, I think bringing it back, to just a parallel to business, bringing it back to, okay, I'm trying to encourage these behaviors and what am I doing to encourage them? Because I think when we're encouraging them without kind of living them, and that I don't mean perfectly, but that's where I see like big disconnect between leaders and their teams.
Absolutely. And that's the challenge. It's not, being a leader is absolutely not, it's one of the hardest jobs you can have, right? You're making difficult decisions all the time. And it's one of the areas I wanted to focus on. I felt like when I was writing my book, I was talking to younger me, right? A little bit. I was like, this is the person who's coming in and, trying to manage the fact that you've got to make quick decisions with less information. You've got a whole bunch of people who are working with you who have different perspectives, different ways of thinking. You may not even realize how different they are from you. You may be judging them without even sort of fully understanding it. And I think that's the hard part of that job for sure. It's absolutely recognizing how to manage that at the same time. You can't, you can't make everybody happy all the time. It's not decision by committee, and it probably never will be, but it's making people feel heard.
Yeah.
So I always talk about, finding commonality instead of common ground. So just because we don't both agree on the same thing doesn't mean we can't find something amongst us that's common that we both and we can't find a way to understand one another.
Yeah, that's awesome. I really love that. So Javier, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. You can let me know.
I know him.
Oh, you know him. Okay, good thing I used to be a speech therapist. So in a team environment that's expected to produce a decision as a leader, how do you handle a team member that's stalling the team's decision-making process? That's a fantastic question because that happens a lot.
Yeah. No, that absolutely is a big challenge. And I think it's about trying to understand the rationale, because oftentimes why they're stalling it, either there's a fear of change, right? So they're afraid of what's coming and the uncertainty of it. So is that clear? Are they clear of the destination? Sometimes to get there, that means helping them recognize what stays the same. And so sometimes you feel like when something new is happening, a decision is ultimately leading in a different path. Let's talk about what actually is staying the same and what this new path looks like. So there's a little bit of that. I think the other thing is just, is it because, again, they feel like there's too much information or I'm overwhelmed by trying to decide. So I think it starts with going, what is stalling that? Are they don't like the choices that are in front of them? They feel like they need to know more before they can make the decision. Do they feel like they haven't been heard and that people aren't considering their perspective? So what is getting in the way of that? And I think that will help because if it's about letting go of information, that is probably a different issue than knowing that they're fearful of the next step and what that looks like. A lot of times, communication is obviously one of the biggest challenges in all organizations. It comes down to that it's not fully understood where we're going. And so that idea of having to make a decision feels like an end. And that's, I think, what's scary for a lot of people. And I said the other is just that they're like, I don't know why we're making this decision, or I feel like I don't know enough information. And how do you hold them through, well, what do we know? And what could happen if we don't have all the information? What does the possible outcomes look like? Because if you can provide some guidance and almost de-risk it, I think, considering the different possibilities, which is that pre-mortem idea, if these are the different ways it could end, then let's think about the implications. And now we've actually made this decision a little bit less scary because we've thought about what could happen as opposed to just sort of jumping forward.
Yeah. And I think too, sometimes in my experience, someone is resisting and they themselves may not even fully know why they're resistant. Like they know they're not in agreement with the decision and they have their reason why they're not, but the real reason they're not isn't even fully clear to them sometimes.
Yeah.
And what I see often is that the way that conflict is leaned into there is often like at 100 miles an hour, right? So listen, this is the way we're going. You need to get on board, da, da, da. And in my experience, I was just working on something in some materials in relation to supplier diversity program. And there's sometimes resistance to bringing in new suppliers in a supply chain. And my observation had been, we often see that resistance as something we need to fight against. And sometimes we need to step back and ask questions around, what is it about bringing in new suppliers that concerns you? And not, when the person shares the thing that concerns them, not argue back why they're wrong, gather more information, right? And which used to be what I did. That was what came naturally to me, right? Listen until I have enough proof that you're wrong.
No, I think we share a bit of advice on that one as well. So
yes. And so, I find by stepping back to understand what the concerns are, like you're saying, then you can give them a better support and information. You may have to gather enough to be able to get to the bottom of what the concern really is. And then I find once you get there, which sometimes takes a little bit more time than just pushing forward in the short term, but in the long term, or medium term even.
And as always, it's the balance, because there's some point where you have to move forward, and you're going to get everybody along the path.
Absolutely.
Probably not, but how do you keep continuing to bring them along? How do you understand what is holding them back? Recognizing that you may never get them on the path, and in which cases, I'll quote one of my HR leaders: "We don't want any prisoners." So if you ultimately, if there's a reason they don't want to be along the path, and you've done everything to help them understand it, that's unfortunate. But I think that's the goal: is if you can help them recognize what the barriers are, help them recognize how to let go of whatever that is, and guide them and support them through that. That's obviously the initial idea.
Yeah, I love what you're saying there, because I think that's very true, that there, needs to be space to gather information and understand, but also, it can't always be everything by consensus, or nothing moves forward. So it's a bit of
and I think that is a risk, and that's hopefully what people don't hear from the advice, which is you do need everybody to agree, because then nothing would get accomplished, and organizations can't. There's a reason why, unfortunately, leaders make the big bucks. It's because they have to make big decisions with little information, and they need to ultimately be the ones to own that decision. But what they can do is encourage their people to be willing to take the risk, to give ideas, to encourage. I always talk about encouraging failure, right? It's okay to fail. And that's a lot of times too, if someone feels like, well, I don't want to make this decision because I'm afraid to make a mistake, or what I see happening a lot is that people don't make the decision, and then they defer to their manager to make the decision for them. And then the manager accidentally enables them because they want to get it going. Okay, I'll just do it. Let's go. And that ultimately kind of just reinforces that I don't have to make the decision because it's been made for me.
Yeah, there's a lot of steps to work out.
Yeah. And ultimately, I also like to say, like, no decision is a decision. So people who get lost in it, who are like, well, it's easier to just not make the decision, but then the opportunity passes. And we are actually biased. There's been studies to prove, sorry, the dog's barking, studies to prove that we're actually more biased to not make a decision than we are to make one and fail. So we'd rather go, no, I'm not going to do it at all, and then know that, well, I didn't do anything, as opposed to doing something.
Right, it can't be my fault.
Then exactly, it's that blame feeling. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just give one last shout for anyone who has any final questions here for Christi, if you want to drop them in the chat, because we'll be done in the next 5 or so minutes. I do want to give you a moment to share, though, because you are almost on your way to publishing your new book, Truth Warriors. So can you speak to us a little bit about that?
Thanks, Lindsay. Yeah, so it's a few weeks out, I think. It's pretty close, and I'm going to have it in paperback, audiobook, as well as ebook. So hopefully, and it talks very much about, obviously, what we're talking about here is how do we understand our natural tendencies in decision making? How do we recognize those biases that are shaping our experiences and creating our own truth? And how do we think about ways in which we can, what I would call lead truth, which is actually sort of enable different perspectives, put structure in place in organizations, consider alternatives, reward failure, recognize, individual differences. All of that is really key. And it includes a model that will allow you to look at where you land on the scale of rational and intuitive, as well as what I call conflict assertive or aggressive, or conflict averse, because I find that to be the spectrum there as well. So so that's coming out in the next couple of weeks, and you can my website is www.truthwarriors.ca. That's fancy. That's cool. So if you look
I didn't do it. StreamYard did, but
you can see some of the details of it coming soon. The cover will be revealed shortly. And if you have an interest in the assessment, if you go there and go to truthwarriors.ca/assessment, it's like I'm saying the words and they appear. Then you're actually you can do the assessment and find out for yourself where you lean on that scale of conflict and decision making. So
very interesting. Yeah,
kind of our starting point.
And I was saying to you earlier that when I was on your website, just the messaging on it really speaks to me. And so I invite everyone to go and take a peek. And I will just pop over to comments to see if anyone had any last questions. No, it doesn't look like it. So I guess, people can reach out to connect with Christi through her website, LinkedIn. And I invite you to check out that assessment and see where you fall. Is there any last thing you want to add before we sign off?
Well, just to thank you for the opportunity. It's always a pleasure chatting with you. I do feel like we've lived parallel universes a little bit, so it's nice to be able to connect with you. It's funny, I'm stopping myself lately. I've been saying I'm looking for like-minded people. I'm actually trying to look for different-minded people. And if I do that, then I'll expand my world. But I still, talking to you has been extremely enjoyable. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, thank you. And that actually just reminded me, not that I'd forgotten that we'd done it, but Christi she was one of my very first podcast guests back when I had no idea how much work there was behind doing a podcast. Yeah. Although I still love it. And so she's episode 10, and we talk about conflict and decision-making, but it wasn't at all the exact conversation that we just had. And so you can check that out at lindsaylapaquette.com/podcast. Like I said, it's episode 10, and there's also a little spot there where if you want to subscribe, you get notifications every week of that weekly podcast and who will be coming on my live. And so you can check that out there, and I get to listen to Christi a little bit longer. So I guess on that note, I will say thank you to everyone for joining us tonight, and we will see you back again. I don't know if I'm going to be back here in 2 weeks. It's been a little nutty, but I'll for sure be back in a month, and I can't even recall who I'm speaking with. Give me 1 second.
I'm definitely going to check that out.
That far in advance. I'm speaking. Whoa. Okay, yeah, no, I'm speaking with Melanie Parrish, and we're going to be talking about the experimental leader based on her book, which is really interesting. So, and if I do schedule someone in the next 2 weeks, I will let you know in LinkedIn. It's going to depend on kind of what's going on at home. So we'll see everyone back in a month at latest. And thank you, Christi, for joining me tonight.
Thank you, Lindsay. Have a great night.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.